All right, let's learn how to take these two rectangular pieces of fabric and turn it into a fun disappearing 4-patch block. You can turn it any which way that you want. It does end up being a square, so you can play around with the design. But to get started, we need to cut out two pieces of fabric that measure 5 inches by 10 inches. I like to use my TheCraftyGemini 5 by 10 ruler because it can be used as a template here, since the dimensions we need match exactly to the dimensions of the ruler. So I have a dark fabric and a light fabric. When you have a light and a dark together and we make this block, we end up with some good visual interest. So let's put one on top of the other with pretty sides touching along the long edges. You can place some pins if you want to, like this. Then we're going to head over to the sewing machine and use a scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to stitch right down here. I like to shorten my stitch length to about 2 millimeters. Anywhere between 2 and 2.5 is good. And then I kind of scooted the needle position over so that I can sew that scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I don't even bother back stitching at the beginning and end here, since we will have other perpendicular seams that will secure these stitches in place. So we stitched it up, then we're going to press. If you have a wooden tailor's clapper, go ahead and use it here. Then I'm going to open this and we'll press the seam allowance towards the darker of the two fabrics and then hit it with the clapper again. Next up, we need to make a few more cuts. So turn it so that the seam you just sewed is running horizontally in front of you. And from the left, we're going to measure 5 inches to the right. Again, I like using my ruler here because it's the exact width of it. So cut the entire unit you just created in half. And if we turn one of these, you see we end up with a nice 4-patch. So this is the prep work. Put one on top of the other with pretty sides touching. Send those seam allowances in opposite directions to reduce some bulk, and place your pins. You probably guessed the next step. We're going to the sewing machine to use that same scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to stitch down the pinned edge. All right, next up, we'll give it a good press. If you have that clapper, remember to clap it. And for pressing the seam allowance, I just send it to one side or the other. You could even press it open if you prefer. Back at the cutting mat here, we need to make our next two cuts. With the 4-patch like this, we want to measure in from the left 2.5 inches. So you can see at the bottom of my ruler there, I am stopping the edge of the fabric at the 2.5 inch mark. Make sure that it's running all the way up the block, and then we're going to slice. So we want to make this 2.5 inch cut in from the left and from the right. So I need to spin this around. If you have a rotating cutting mat, that comes in handy here, because then you would just spin it to make the exact same cut on the opposite end. Okay, so on this side again, measuring from the fabric edge at 2.5, I'll make the cut. So we can set aside these two outer strips. This inside 4-patch unit, we're going to turn it this way and do the same thing by cutting 2.5 inches in from the left and the right again. So we'll make these two cuts. And this is the final cut that we need to make for this disappearing 4-patch. So now we're just going to kind of position the pieces that we have cut in the correct orientation. So at the top here, we're going to spin this one around. So to make a 4-patch with this top unit, then you still have a 4-patch in the middle, and then this bottom one needs to be turned again to create the same type of looking 4-patch at the bottom. Flip one on top of that center unit, place your pins, make sure to send those seam allowances in opposite directions to reduce bulk, and then repeat the same thing to the bottom unit as well. And then we're sewing down both of those sides with that scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance at the sewing machine. Make sure to have a short stitch length again. Keep it around 2 to 2.4 millimeters in stitch length, and that should be good. Once we have that sewn, we're going to give it a press. I usually will just press the seam allowances away from that center 4-patch unit, and that is good enough. Now let's go ahead and add the two exterior strips that we had set aside earlier. You want them to be like this, okay? You don't necessarily want to match up at the top, because then it's disjointed right there with that center seam. Instead, line up the center seam of the strip with the center seam of the main unit, and that way you'll have a little bit of extra sticking up at the top and bottom that can get trimmed away. Do not line it up like this. Make sure that whatever fabric is on the ends matches the fabric that's on the side. So once you sort that out the way that I did here, put one on top of the other with pretty sides touching, place your pins, and we're going to sew with the same scant 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and a nice short stitch length. All right, now we need to add the other one. Remember, the fabrics on the ends need to be in line with what fabric is on the side of the strip. So like this. Flip one on top of the other, making sure that you're matching up those center seams. Place your pins and stitch and press this one up as well. Now it's time to trim it up. Your block here, after you trim away the excess that's sticking out on both ends, should measure 8.5 inches. So don't just start cutting off any excess that you see. You want to measure first and then cut to make sure that you end up with an 8.5 inch this way by 8.5 inch this way quilt block, okay? Finished inside of the quilt, it will measure 8 inches by 8 inches, but all of your individual blocks should be 8.5 inches square. You can see what the finished disappearing 4-patch block looks like. Feel free to make as many as you need for the size quilt that you're working on, and I hope you enjoyed this step-by-step tutorial on making a disappearing 4-patch block.